Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, written by Patrick Buchanan, 2008. 1. The end of Splendid Isolation. Britain pursued isolation from the Europe of alliances, but in 1896 steps to end British isolation were required. In 1897 the Russian fleet steamed into the Chinese harbor of Port Arthur, obliging British warships to vacate the area. In 1898 a crisis erupted in northeast Africa. In 1899 the Boer War broke out. In 1900 the British position in China was threatened by Russia and Japan. Entente cordiale. In 1989 Britain sided with the United States in its war with Spain, then settled the Alaska boundary dispute in America's favor. Then Britain withdrew her fleet from the Caribbean. With America appeased, Britain turned to Asia. Japan needed an ally to balance off Russia's ally, France. In 1902 the Anglo-Japanese Treaty was signed. In 1904 Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval squadron at Port Arthur. The victory for Japan was the worst defeat ever inflicted on a Western power by an Asian people, In 1904 Britain and France negotiated an Entente cordiale, a cordial understanding. Centuries of hostility came to an end. In 1905 the Anglo-Japanese Treaty was elevated into a full alliance. In 1906 British and French officers plotted Britain's entry into a Franco-German war. In 1907 Britain entered into an Anglo-Russian convention, ending their 80-year conflict. In the Triple Alliance were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Opposite was the Franco-Russian alliance backed by Great Britain, which was allied to Japan. Only America among the great powers remained free of entangling alliances. You have a new world. A united Germany had emerged as the first power in Europe. Bismarck believed his nation had nothing to gain from war. He crafted a series of treaties to maintain a European balance of power favorable to Germany. By 1914 Berlin boasted the world's third largest overseas empire. France and Russia were expansionist. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 stipulated that a partial mobilization by any member of the Triple Alliance, Austria, Italy, or Germany, would trigger hostilities against all three, Kaiser Wilhelm II, grandson of Queen Victoria, had never plotted to bring down the British Empire, putting the Kaiser down, but he committed one of the great blunders in German history. He decided to challenge Britannia's rule of the waves with a high seas fleet. The building of the German fleet ended the century of splendid isolation. The high seas fleet, to the Germans, it was not Britain that threatened them, but giant Russia and revanchist France. By the 20th century, Germany's trade and merchant marine rivaled Britain's. The balance of power in Europe was under threat. Some British were avidly seeking an opportunity to stalk and sink the German fleet before it could grow. In 1905 Wilhelm II challenged the French hegemony in Morocco by forcing Britain to take sides in the alignment of the European powers. German naval policy completed the division of Europe into two political camps. Challenging the Royal Navy would prove a principal factor in Germany's defeat. In 1914 the arrival of a British expeditionary force in France blunted the German drive into France. The Germans were willing to make a naval deal in return for a neutrality statement. Balance of power politics. Britain's refusal to give a neutrality pledge demonstrates that beneath the Anglo-German friction lay clashing concepts of security. To Britain, security rested on a balance of power, a divided Europe with British power backing the weaker coalition. To Germany, security lay in unifying Europe under her leadership, as Bismarck had done, under Britain's balance of power doctrine. Germany could become an ally only if displaced as first power in Europe. The British policy amounted to a moral declaration of war on Germany, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was, the first power in Europe, The statesman most responsible for the abandonment of splendid isolation for a secret alliance with France was Edward Grey. The secrets of Edward Grey. This alliance was not what the British people wanted. Grey conveyed to the French that Britain would be prepared to fight with them against Germany in the event of a war. Neither the cabinet nor parliament was aware that Grey had committed Britain to war if France were invaded. In 1911 Churchill was brought in on the secret. Friends forever. British hawks looked to European war to enhance prestige and expand the empire. Yet, as the summer of 1914 began, no one expected war. The high seas fleet had nothing to do with Britain's decision to go to war, but everything to do with converting Britain from a friendly power into a probable enemy should war come. On June 28, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, and his wife Sophie had been assassinated in Sarajevo. Message from British to German naval officers. Friends today, friends in the future, friends forever. 2. Last summer of yesterday, Austria delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. It was described as the gravest event for many years past in European politics, as it may be the prelude to a war in which at least four of the great powers may be involved: Austria, Germany, Russia, and France. Geared up and happy, the Austrians did not want a European war. Vienna wanted a short, sharp war to punish Serbia for murdering the heir to the throne, and to put an end to Serb plotting to pull apart their empire. Serbia accepted 9 of Austria's 10 demands. The Kaiser was relieved and elated. With it disappears every reason for war. But the Austrian ambassador in Belgrade telephoned Vienna. When news hit that Serbia had failed to submit to all 10 demands, crowds were in the streets clamoring for war. On July 27th, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war. Few in Britain had an inkling that within 7 days England would enter a world war. Churchill: everything tends toward catastrophe and collapse. I am interested, geared up and happy. Germany was desperately trying to avert the war to which Churchill looked forward with anticipation. The Schlieffen Plan, in prodding the cabinet into war. The ace of trumps for Grey and Churchill was Belgium. Britain had extracted a guarantee of Belgium's neutrality. However, it authorized, but did not require, Britain to go to war should any nation violate the neutrality of Belgium. The Schlieffen Plan called for the German army to strike first their strongest enemy, France, then to shift her armies to Russia before it rumbled into East Prussia. If Belgium resisted, she must be mercilessly crushed. German survival commanded it. The Germans had forgotten Bismarck, who warned that preventive war is like committing suicide out of fear of death. The arrival of a British expeditionary force that crossed the Channel in the first 2 weeks without hindrance from the High Seas Fleet would blunt the German advance and defeat the Schlieffen Plan. Winston alone was buoyant. Germany declared war on Russia and on France. The British Royal Navy would block any move by the German High Seas Fleet into the Channel to attack French shipping or bombard the coast. The cabinet members looked racked with anxiety and some stricken with grief. Winston alone was buoyant. 6 cabinet members, seeing no cause to justify a vast expenditure of British blood and treasure in a Franco-German war, pleaded to lead them out. Had Lloyd George agreed, and had these ministers resigned, Asquith's cabinet would have broken up, his government might have fallen, and history would have taken another course. Lloyd George's wife: the invasion of Belgium was a heaven-sent excuse for supporting a declaration of war, Churchill didn't care for the Belgians. He thought their behavior in the Congo disgraceful. Of all the colonial powers in Africa, none had acted with greater barbarity than the Belgium of King Leopold. If war came, Churchill was determined to violate Belgian neutrality by ordering the Royal Navy to blockade Antwerp to prevent its becoming a port of entry for goods destined for Germany. The German invasion of Belgium enabled the British War Party to put a high moral gloss on a war they had already decided to fight, British people who did not want to go to war for France were suddenly wildly enthusiastic about war for Belgium. A poll on August 1st would have shown 95% against hostilities. A poll on the following Tuesday, August 4th, would have resulted in a vote of 99% in favor. Churchill: every British heart burned for little Belgium. The British interests were to prevent Germany from crushing France. Churchill: 6 months after the First Battle of Ypres, with tens of thousands of British soldiers in their graves, I think a curse should rest on me, because I am so happy. I know this war is smashing and shattering the lives of thousands every moment, and yet, I cannot help it. I enjoy every second, why Britain fought. Britain turned the European war into a world war. Reasons: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Preserve France as a great power. British honor. The character and credibility of the British nation were at issue. Retention of power. The Liberals went to war partly to keep the Tories out. Germanophobia. Britain resented the rise of Germany. Imperial ambition and opportunism, once Belgium became Britain's cause, Liberals who had opposed war only hours before enthusiastically joined the crusade. Why the Liberals went along, despite their sudden enthusiasm. The Liberal Party and the people had no vote in Britain's decision to enter the bloodiest conflict in Western history. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and much of Africa were swept up in a war without first being asked, neither the Kaiser nor Chancellor Bettman is blameless for the blow that hurled the modern world on its course of self-destruction, but neither entered it with the zest of Churchill. The Kaiser's culpability. None of the monarchs, Nicholas II, Wilhelm II, George V, or Franz Joseph, wanted war, but more resolute and harder men had taken charge of affairs, Wilhelm II to Tsar Nicholas II and King George V, July 31, 1914. It is not I who bears the responsibility for the disaster which now threatens the entire civilized world. Even at this moment, the decision to stave it off lies with you. German war aims. Germany would have welcomed any way out of a fight with Russia, France, and England, the butcher bird of Europe. 1815 to 1914, Germany was among the least militaristic of European powers. 1871 to 1914, the Germans under Bismarck and Wilhelm II did not fight a single war, while Britain, Russia, Italy, Turkey, Japan, Spain, and the United States were all involved in wars, it was put out by Germany after Britain had declared war and called for the annexation of the northeast coast of France. The September Program. Germany's European project was not one with which Britain could not have lived. The reduction of Russian power in Eastern Europe, the creation of a Central European customs union, and acquisition of French colonies, these were all goals that were complementary to British interests. Germany was unaware a war with France meant war with the British Empire, even friendly biographers and memoirists seem astonished by Winston Churchill's lust for war in 1914. Winston is becoming a real danger. Churchill's cabinet colleagues were both awed and repelled by his lust for war. Churchill was unafraid to break the rules of war and brush aside international law. He had made certain the British would decide how the Americans viewed the war, 1918, the British public rejected noble sentiments and took up the cry hang the Kaiser. 3. A poisonous spirit of revenge. Hang the Kaiser. The House of Commons demanded the utmost severity for Germany. They wanted every last pound of German flesh, hell's dirtiest work. Though Germany's fate was to be decided, no German had been invited. The Allies had come to Paris to punish them as the guilty nation responsible for destroying the peace. When German representatives were summoned to Paris to receive the terms of the Allies, they were stunned at the amputations to be forced upon them. Versailles stripped from Germany 1/10 of her people and 1/8 of her territory. Their overseas empire was wholly confiscated. Germany's rivers were internationalized and she was forced to open her home market to Allied imports, but denied equal access to Allied markets. Germany was forbidden ever again to build armored cars, tanks, heavy artillery, submarines, or an air force and was to remain forever naked to her enemies. 1920, the Allies set the final bill for reparations at 32 billion gold marks, an impossible sum. Germany was forced to confess to and accept full responsibility for causing the war and all the damage done. Wilhelm II was declared a war criminal, forcing the Germans to confess to a historic crime and agree to lie. That they alone were to blame for the war was as foolish as it was unjust. The effect on the German psyche of forcing the nation to confess to a crime Germans did not believe they had committed was poisonous. The humiliation created the thirst for revenge which the National Socialists so cleverly exploited. The starvation blockade. Germany faced invasion and death by starvation if she refused. More Germans have died among the civil population from the direct effects of the war than have died on the battlefield. The people felt that an end by bullets is preferable to death by starvation. Frankfurt 1920. The funerals never ceased all day. Churchill favored letting the Belgians starve and blaming the Germans. Pope Benedict XV's plea for an end to the blockade was ignored. Beasts they are. Not until July 12, 1919, did the Allies fully lift the starvation blockade. The Germans felt utterly betrayed and blamed America. The price France exacted for giving up any claim to the Rhineland was high. America and Britain were to be obligated to come to France's aid should Germany attack her again. The Rhineland. France was left with no security treaty and no buffer state, only a 15-year occupation of the Rhineland. Both banks of the Rhine were to remain demilitarized in perpetuity. The Czechs succeeded Paris at the expense of their neighbors Germany, Austria, and Hungary, who were to be punished and weakened. Most favored nation. The Czechs knew what they wanted and were ruthless in taking it. They created in the new Czechoslovakia the 10th most industrialized nation, having stripped Austria and Hungary of 70 to 80% of their industry. The new nation was 1-2 Czech, 1/4 German, 1/5 Slovaks and Hungarians. Trianon, 1920. Treaty of Trianon. Hungary was mutilated, reduced from 125,000 square miles to 36,000. Hungarian lands went to the Czechs, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes and even to Austria, Transylvania, and the 2 million Hungarians residing there went to Romania. No one bothered to consult the people about their wishes. Hungarian bitterness at the Wilsonian peace was as deep as it was in Germany. Germans were handed over to Denmark, Belgium, France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Lithuania without their consent. Germans, Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews were handed over to Prague. The newborn nations were almost as multi-ethnic as the Habsburg Empire, but lacked her history, lineage, and moral authority. Hungary, however, was the ultimate victim, the winners were the Czechs, Romanians, and Serbs, the losers were the Austrians, Germans, Hungarians, Bulgarians, and Russians. Romania. The size of Romania doubled. The British, French, Italian, and Japanese empires enlarged by 1,000,000 square miles. The Poles felt denied because of favoritism toward the Czechs. Americans concluded that their 116,000 sons died for nothing. Wedged between a brooding Bolshevik Russia and a humiliated Germany were 6 new nations: Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, the fruits of victory. The Hohenzollern, Romanov, Habsburg, and Ottoman empires had crashed in ruins. Mesopotamia and Palestine, taken from the Turks, had gone to Great Britain. The costs of victory, while it appeared to the world that the British Empire had made out wonderfully well, Britain had sustained losses from which she would never recover. The war had discredited much of the rhetoric of national pride, honor, and sacrifice, as well as faith in the notions of reason, progress, and humanism. The modern Western civilization that had grown up since the Renaissance was under siege from outside and from within. The myth of Western invincibility was destroyed. Rebellions broke out in Ireland, Egypt, Iraq, and India. 1921, epidemic of Anglophobia in America, who had become perhaps the greatest military power. 1930, America fell deep into depression, Romanov Russia was gone. Atop the largest nation sat a grisly gang of Bolshevik terrorists committed to world revolution and the destruction of all Western empires and nations. Communists attempted to seize power in Berlin. Germany could no longer fulfill her ancient duty to keep the Russians out of Europe. Churchill recognized the danger of the regime of Lenin and Trotsky, and repeatedly urged Allied intervention, There was scarcely a promise Wilson made to the Germans at the time of the armistice that was not broken, or a principle of his that he did not violate. The dilemma was that Allied goals were irreconcilable. A Carthaginian peace? In 1945, Churchill too traced the origins of the unnecessary war back to Versailles. This war should never have come unless we had driven the Habsburgs out of Austria and the Hohenzollerns out of Germany. By making these vacuums, we gave the opening for the Hitlerite monster to crawl out of its sewer onto the vacant thrones. The men of Versailles had brought home the peace of vengeance. Their children would pay the price for their having failed to bring home a piece of justice, In 1921, the critical issue for Britain was whether to renew the Anglo-Japanese Treaty. It complicated the special relationship with the United States, yet the benefits of the alliance were apparent. 4. A lot of silly little cruisers, choosing between friends. Not to renew the alliance carried with it the likelihood of changing Japanese forbearance towards the British Empire into hostility. Disastrously for Britain, she chose to appease the United States, an act of breathtaking stupidity. Britain terminated her 20-year-old alliance. The Anglo-Japanese Treaty was replaced by the Four-Power Treaty, by which America, Britain, France, and Japan agreed to settle their disputes by diplomacy. It would prove a disaster for the British Empire. Now alone in Asia, Britain faced a hostile Soviet Union, a xenophobic China, and a bitter Japan. The destruction of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1922 was fatal to peace in the Far East. By 1930, Japan had become a military dictatorship, America seized the world's imagination with a plan to slash the size of all the great navies of the world. Rolls-Royce, Ford. No nation would be more affected than Britain, for whom sea power meant survival. America was calling for a 10-year holiday in shipbuilding and the scuttling of British, U.S., and Japanese capital ships until the three navies reached a 5 5/3 ratio. This looks just like Rolls-Royce Ford, said an insulted Japanese diplomat. Balfour, head of the British delegation, was awarded the Order of the Garter, the oldest order of chivalry and highest honor a British sovereign can bestow. Why did Britain capitulate to the Americans? 1. Much of the British elite was enthralled to the myth of the Americans as cousins who saw their destiny as one with a mother country. The special relationship was a British fantasy too. The national debt had exploded 14-fold during the war. The Yankees now held the mortgage on the empire. 3. Wilsonianism. The belief that the horror of the Great War had given birth to a new world where men recognized the insanity of war and were disposed to work for peace, had rooted itself deep in the British soul. Internationalism and pacifism were the bold new ideas. In 1932, Britain finally abandoned Churchill's 10-year rule. But the hour was late, and the British position in Asia now perilous to the point of being hopeless. Japan feared the rising power of the Chinese nationalists and the communists of Mao Zedong, backed by Stalin. The Stimson Doctrine. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson put America and Britain on the path to war with Japan. With Hitler now in power in Germany, a two-front war against Germany and Japan was emerging. By 1931, Britain's Asian empire was ripe for the taking. Only the Americans could stop Japan, but the Americans were not interested. 1935, collapse of the Stresa front. Italy felt cheated, for her war sacrifices had included over 400,000 deaths. Mussolini constantly urged a revision, and predicted a second European war if this was not done. In 1922, however, it was domestic unrest that led to a fascist march on Rome that brought to power this ex-socialist, who was determined to gain for Italy that place in the sun. Hitler's admiration for him bordered on adulation. Britain, France, Italy and Germany would meet to rectify the injustices of Versailles to avert another war, but Mussolini's pact was rejected by France, Britain and the pro-French Little Entente of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania. In 1933, Churchill vigorously attacked Mussolini's proposal, the one comprehensive plan set forth in Europe, which might have revised post-war treaties in a peaceful manner, and held Hitler in check, The policy Hitler would pursue began to take shape within a year of his having taken control of the Nazi Party, selling out South Tyrol. His first goal was a Rome-Berlin alliance. In return for an alliance, Hitler was prepared to surrender all German claims to South Tyrol. Railing against the injustices of Versailles was a constant theme in his rise to power. He displayed an opportunistic willingness to write off German lands and peoples to avoid wars he did not want, and to gather allies for the new German goal, an empire in the East. The murder of Dollfuss, Hitler's first trip to meet Mussolini in Venice in 1934, was a conspicuous failure. One problem they discussed was Austria. Determined to bring Austria into Germany's orbit, Hitler knew the time was not ripe. Any attempt at Anschluss would be forcibly resisted by Italy, which saw Austria as its buffer state. Hitler was warned by Mussolini not to intervene, and he assured he would respect Austrian sovereignty but went no further. For his SS was secretly backing Austrian Nazis in a terror campaign against Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. Mussolini sensed what was about to happen. Dollfuss outlawed the socialists. His real concern was the Nazi Party, banned since July 1933. Dollfuss intended to eliminate it. In Mussolini he had a friend, 2 weeks after Hitler left Venice came the Night of the Long Knives, his liquidation of SA leader Ernst Röhm. The Night of the Long Knives was the first act of state terror of the Third Reich, and revealed the character of Hitler and his regime. To the Nazis, murder was a legitimate weapon to deal with political enemies. Between 150 and 200 people died. Those men he killed were his closest collaborators, who hoisted him into power. Mussolini now knew that the Hitler he had considered a buffoon in Venice was a decisive, ruthless, menacing, and formidable figure, unlike any European statesman with whom he had dealt in a decade in power. 6 weeks after Hitler's visit to Venice, 150 Austrian Nazis stormed the Chancery in Vienna. Dollfuss was shot and bled to death, the only European leader to die a martyr's death resisting Nazism. Hitler was alarmed, given the Austrian Nazi hand in the coup. Mussolini might well conclude that Hitler had lied to him. Il Duce sent word to Vienna, if Germany invades, Italy will go to war. The crisis passed and, in January of 1935, Hitler's Reich received an enormous boost in morale and legitimacy. Crucial meeting in 1935. The British Prime Minister and French Prime Minister and Foreign Minister met with Mussolini in Stresa. They denounced German rearmament as a violation of Versailles, the Locarno Pact. Locarno was crucial, for it represented the voluntary acceptance by Berlin of what had been imposed upon Germany at Versailles. At Locarno, however, the borders of Eastern Europe had gone unmentioned. The Stresa Conference, at Stresa, 10 years after Locarno, Britain, France, and Italy had agreed to support the independence and integrity of Austria, but the vigorous Mussolini and the firm determination of France contrasted to the British horror of any commitment and Britain's yearning for some kind of arrangement with Germany. The clarity, logic and the force of the Franco-Italian position was met by British vacillation, hesitancies and obfuscations. A committee of 13, including Russia, was set up to consider sanctions. The Third Reich was diplomatically isolated. Hitler decided the moment was ripe for a peace offensive. He reassured Mussolini that Germany had neither the intention nor wish to annex or incorporate Austria. The Hitler-Baldwin Pact, Hitler declared, The German government has the straightforward intention to find and maintain a relationship with the British people and state, which will prevent for all time a repetition of the only struggle there has been between the two nations. An Anglo-German naval agreement was signed permitting Germany to construct a fleet 35% of the Royal Navy and a submarine force equal to Great Britain's. Britain had sacrificed both Allied solidarity and principle. A naval treaty with Nazi Germany meant Britain put bilateral relations with Hitler ahead of any reliance on her Stresa front partners. Britain had undermined the Stresa concept of collective security and drove Mussolini straight into the arms of Hitler, as the British Empire controlled almost every other piece of real estate in East Africa. Italy's annexation of part or all of Ethiopia posed no threat to Great Britain. Abyssinia. For Britain to oppose Italy's annexation of Ethiopia would be hypocritical. Mussolini believed that, as the British-French Entente of 1904 had put Egypt in Britain's sphere and Morocco in France's, Italy should be given a free hand in Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, brusquely brushing aside British offer Eden. Il Duce told him that Italy would accept nothing less than all the territories Ethiopia had taken in the last century. Rome-London relations went rapidly downhill. Isolated, Mussolini decided he had to act quickly. The Eden debacle. The Abyssinian War. The Abyssinians never stood a chance. Moral indignation was almost universal. British ideals now clashed with British interests. Should Britain avert its gaze from Ethiopia to keep Italy as a Stresa front partner against Germany, or brand Italy an aggressor, impose sanctions, and lose Italy? The British had by now been converted to moralistic internationalism, Ethiopian Foreign Secretary Hoare and Francis Laval put together a peace proposal. Mussolini was prepared to accept the Hoare-Laval plan, but political panic and public uproar over the Hoare-Laval plan caused Britain to act against vital British interests. Eden made the mistake of trying to ally himself with Hitler and to oppose Mussolini instead of the reverse. The sanctions were too weak to compel Mussolini to give up, but they were wounding enough to enrage the Italian people, by insisting on the imposition of sanctions. Great Britain made an enemy of Mussolini and destroyed all hope of a united front against German aggression. When Britain and France turned on Mussolini, he turned on them. The Stresa front was dead. In 1937, Italy adhered to the Anti-Comintern Pact of Germany and Japan, established to resist subversion by the Communist International, centered in Moscow, From the first time Churchill met Mussolini, he seemed taken with the fascist dictator. Churchill and Mussolini. He praised fascism's contribution to the world and the struggle against Bolshevism, with an unusual blindness, even in those times when the blind were leading the blind. Churchill continued to hold Mussolini in high esteem. 2 years after Mussolini had embraced Hitler, Churchill was still proclaiming the genius of Mussolini. It would be a dangerous folly to underrate the enduring position in world history which Mussolini will hold, or the amazing qualities of courage, comprehension, self-control and perseverance which he exemplifies, Americans saw no vital U.S. interest in whether German soldiers occupied German soil. But why did Britain and France do nothing? 1936, the Rhineland. Behind the Allied inaction, Britain was now led by decent men with dreadful memories and troubled consciences, who were afflicted with guilt over what had been done. No one wanted another European war. The German reoccupation of the Rhineland was, from the British point of view, an improvement and a success for British policy. Britain believed and hoped Hitler's ambitions might be directed to the east, The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 had led to the fall of the French imperial throne. By the end of the Great War, the imperial crowns of Russia, Germany and Austria-Hungary lay in the dust. The Second World War was to destroy the thrones of Italy, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania and Yugoslavia. Anti-Semitic laws were enacted. Churchill said Hitler should do the noble thing voluntarily, withdraw all troops from the Rhineland, and thereby earn the goodwill and gratitude of the civilized world. The British public did not care about the Germans reoccupying their own territory, Why, when Hitler had sent in only 3 battalions, with orders to withdraw immediately if they met resistance, did France not march in? Why was France paralyzed? Decisive action might have prevented World War II. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, the dictator could never have survived such a fiasco. Hitler himself admitted as much. In 1923, most of the world had denounced France when they had marched into the Ruhr to force Germany to pay the war reparations imposed at Versailles. By 1930, by adopting the Maginot Line strategy and mentality, wholly defensive in character, France had signaled to all of Europe that she would fight only if invaded, For France, the failure to oppose the German reoccupation of the demilitarized zone was a disaster. and one from which all the later ones of even greater magnitude followed. The two Western democracies had missed their last chance to halt Nazi Germany, the whole structure of European peace and security set up in 1919 collapsed. Seeing France's paralysis, Belgium's King Leopold III declared neutrality and scrapped the Franco-Belgian alliance of 1920. The new reality would soon assert itself and all Europe would realize its implications. With Mussolini now aligned with Hitler, no power could intervene directly to halt Hitler's inevitable next move, turning Austria into a vassal state. After Austria must come the turn of Czechoslovakia and Poland, both of which held large German populations anxious to join the Reich, Hitler sensed that if he were patient, the Allies, full of guilt over Versailles and horrified at the prospect of another war, would come to offer him what he wanted. 1938, Anschluss, the Hitler-Halifax summit, singling out Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig. Halifax told Hitler that if far-reaching disturbances could be avoided, all of Germany's grievances from Versailles and Central Europe could be resolved in Germany's favor. Halifax told Hitler what he had hoped to hear: Britain would not go to war to prevent an Anschluss with Austria, transfer the Sudetenland to the Reich, or return of Danzig. Britain might be prepared to serve as honest broker in effecting the return of what rightfully belonged to Germany, if this were all done in a gentlemanly fashion, with England's blessing to bring Austria into Germany's sphere. If done peacefully, Hitler was left with but one problem: how to get the Austrians to agree. Austrian Chancellor von Schuschnigg would provide Hitler his opportunity. The Hitler-Schuschnigg summit. Schuschnigg relights the fuse. While the crisis appeared over, it was not. Schuschnigg had ordered a vote in 4 days where Austrians would choose between Christianity and Nazism, Austria and Germany, Schuschnigg and Hitler. Hitler could not abide humiliation at the hands of Schuschnigg, yet neither he nor the army had prepared for a campaign against Austria. Hitler called his generals to Berlin and ordered all troops anywhere near Austria to be prepared to invade. He departed to lead his army into the land of his birth. Return of the native. In an utterly unexpected decision, Hitler declared the annexation of Austria. Austria was now a province of Germany. Mussolini congratulated Hitler. For 7 years, Austria ceased to exist and became the Ostmark, the Eastmark, the ancient bulwark of Europe against the hordes of Asia. The belief soon became established that Hitler's seizure of Austria was a deliberate plot, devised long in advance, and the first step toward the domination of Europe. This belief was a myth. Everything was improvised in a couple of days, for his Anschluss with Austria. However, Hitler would pay a price. The Anschluss was not an unmitigated triumph for the Third Reich. Many who had been prepared to work with Hitler for redress of grievances dating to Versailles now thought of standing up to him. Germany had lost any moral high ground it had held as the victim of Versailles. Moreover, the abominable public mistreatment of the Jews of Vienna by Austrian Nazis was reported across Europe and America. 8. Munich. The victor, Czechoslovakia, was broken up to appease Hitler. Munich has been called the greatest diplomatic disaster in history. It was also a strategic disaster. The Western democracies lost Russia as an ally. Appeasement has become a synonym for cowardly surrender to evil that leads to desperate war. As Churchill said to the Prime Minister, Chamberlain, you were given a choice between dishonor and war. You chose dishonor. You will have war. Why Munich? To answer that, we must go back to 1919. At Paris, 3.25 million German inhabitants of Bohemia and Moravia had been transferred to the new Czechoslovakia in a flagrant disregard of Wilson's self-proclaimed ideal of self-determination. There were more Germans in Czechoslovakia than Slovaks. Czechoslovakia was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural, Catholic, Protestant conglomerate that had never before existed. From 1920 to 1938, repeated petitions were sent to the League by the repressed minorities of Czechoslovakia. By 1938, the Sudeten-Deutsch were agitating to be rid of Czech rule and become part of the new Reich. Why not tell Hitler no? Britain didn't care whether the Sudetens were in the Reich or out of it. Many British believed justice was on the German side. The problem was that Hitler was singing Wilson's song, demanding that Germans in the Sudetenland be granted the same right of self-determination that had been granted at Paris to Poles and Czechs. The principle of self-determination was his chief instrument for enlarging the Reich by annexation, and for destroying from within the states he intended to attack. Hitler invoked this principle when he annexed Austria and dismembered Czechoslovakia. Also, Britain lacked the military power and strategic reach to save Czechoslovakia, where FDR stood at Munich. FDR's message: this is your war, not ours. Why did France not fight? The French system of alliances rested on strategic nonsense. Britain and France now had to deal with a coarse, brutal German dictator who had cold-bloodedly executed the comrades who had helped hoist him to power. As for Churchill, rather than force the Czechs to give up the Sudetenland, Britain should go to war. His idea was an alliance with Stalin, Churchill's alternative. But no Western statesman had been more eloquent than Churchill in excoriating Bolshevism. Was he willing to ally the mother of parliaments with this monster? Chamberlain despised the Bolsheviks more than the Nazis and fascists. Better Hitler than Stalin was a sentiment shared by leaders of all the nations bordering on Stalin's empire. Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Romania. The Godesberg meeting. At Godesberg, Chamberlain was shaken by the new truculence and intransigence of Hitler. Chamberlain's failure lay in how he behaved at Munich and after Munich. How could Chamberlain believe that by getting Hitler's signature on a 3-sentence statement, he had created a bond of trust and he and Hitler would now work together for peace in Europe? Chamberlain was right in believing the Sudetenland not worth a war, but wrong in believing that by surrendering it to Hitler he had bought anything but time, which he should have used to rally Britain. He wanted peace and deceived himself into believing he had achieved it. Thus did he morally disarm his people, who were so desperate to avoid war they were ready to be deceived. By reveling in the celebration of Munich, Chamberlain disarmed himself. The failure of appeasement, allied fear of Hitler and of them that made them so reasonable now. What doomed Chamberlain's policy was that he was confronted by hard, coarse men, full of resentment, who preferred brutality to get what they wanted, who relished humiliating the weak, and whose ambitions extended beyond what Britain could assent to. With Austria and the Sudetenland now his, Hitler in 1938 had added 10 million Germans to the Reich without firing a shot. It was a Bismarckian achievement. The casus belli of World War II emanated from a decision, 6 months later, that would drag England into a 6-year death struggle at the wrong time, in the wrong place, for the wrong reason. That decision would prove the greatest blunder in British history. 9. Fatal blunder. Poland's turn. Germany offered the Poles a Berlin-Warsaw alliance against Russia. What Hitler sought was a Polish-German alliance, modeled on the Rome-Berlin axis. On Danzig, the basic British and German positions were almost identical. Both wanted its peaceful return to Germany, but the Poles adamantly refused to negotiate. In 1939, Czechoslovakia fell apart. The motives behind Hitler's actions in the Czech crisis of March remain in dispute. Whatever triggered the crisis or motivated Hitler, it was a blunder of historic magnitude and utterly unnecessary. He had made a bitter enemy of Great Britain. Rapprochement with Stalin may have been in Hitler's mind by early 1939, in words drafted by Halifax, Chamberlain turned British policy upside down. The British government was now committed to fight for Poland. Chamberlain's about-face. The Polish guarantee was foolish, futile, and provocative, an ill-considered gesture that placed Britain's destiny in the hands of Polish rulers, men of very dubious and unstable judgment. Chamberlain's reversal was so abrupt and unexpected as to make war inevitable. He made the same blunder as Wilhelm II in 1914. He had given Poland a blank check to start a European war. The French endorsed it only because they had no alternative, thus issued Chamberlain, who never believed Britain had any vital interest in Eastern Europe, a war guarantee to Eastern Europe, the most disastrous diplomatic move of the interwar era. Thus did the British government, in panic over a false report about a German invasion of Poland that was not planned, give a war guarantee to a dictatorship it did not trust, in a part of Europe where it had no vital interests. Committing itself to war it could not win. Churchill in 1948. Here was a decision taken at the worst possible moment and on the least satisfactory ground, which must surely lead to the slaughter of tens of millions of people. The guarantee to Poland, which Churchill had applauded, would force Britain to declare war on Germany 5 months later. Britain was dragged into an unnecessary war, which cost her nearly 400,000 dead, bankruptcy, and the dissolution of the British Empire, Chamberlain appears to have acted out of shame and humiliation at having been played for a fool, out of fear of Tory backbenchers who had turned against Munich in disgust, and out of panic that Hitler was out to dominate the world. Why did Britain do it? Rather than see Poland return Danzig to the Reich, Halifax preferred that Poland fight Germany to the death in a war he knew Poland could not win, because the British could not help. To Halifax, Poland's suicide was preferable to having Hitler chalk up yet another bloodless coup. Was Chamberlain misunderstood? Chamberlain, the guarantee was unprovocative, but stressing that the important point we are concerned with is not the boundary of states, but attacks on their independence. And it is we who will judge whether this independence is threatened or not. Chamberlain was signaling Hitler that the return of Danzig was not opposed by Britain and she would go to war only if he tried to destroy Poland as an independent nation. The war guarantee had not been crafted to give Britain a pretext for war, but to give Chamberlain leverage to persuade the Poles to give Danzig back. Unfortunately, the diplomatic subtlety was lost on Hitler and on the Poles. From that day forward, the Poles refused even to discuss Danzig with Germany, it would have been to the interest of Britain, the United States, and the world to have allowed, and, indeed, to have encouraged, the world's two great dictatorships to fight each other, alternatives to the war guarantee. Such a struggle, with its resultant weakening of both communism and Nazism, could not but have aided in the establishment of a more stable peace. It would have placed the democracies in supreme power in the world. Churchill would never have become prime minister. Germany, after Poland, would have turned on Russia. 10. April Fools. Second thoughts at number 10. Chamberlain would get the war he never wanted, and Churchill would get the war he had sought to bring about. Poles put their trust in the Security Pact. They were repaid for that trust with abandonment and half a century of Nazi and Soviet barbarism. 6. 5 million Poles were killed. Hitler smelt the phony nature of the guarantee. The British guarantee to Poland that solidified Polish determination to fight Nazi Germany in suicidal defiance, in anticipation of British military assistance Chamberlain knew would never come, was the most cynical act in British history. Poland rejected both the German version of negotiations and Hitler's offer to start anew. 11. An unnecessary war. The courtship of Stalin. Hitler won the competition for Stalin's hand. Hitler could be magnanimous in granting Stalin custody of what Stalin would one day have torn from him. The news of the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 23, 1939, shook the world. To Hitler's astonishment, Chamberlain countered his pact with Stalin with a British Mutual Assistance Pact with Beck. Mussolini weaseled out of his pact of steel pledge to go to war, Poland was a multi-ethnic country, with Germans, Balts, Ukrainians and Jews unhappy under Polish rule. Last week of peace, Hitler's generals, up to the hour they crossed the frontier, believed he would find a way to retrieve Danzig and avoid war, as Chamberlain believed that Poland's cause was lost and more an act of suicidal revenge in which millions must die. Ought he not to have resigned rather than lead his country into such a war? An alternative to war, Warsaw was bombed by the Luftwaffe, while Bomber Command ineffectually struck at German naval targets in the North Sea. Poland abandoned. The French army entered a few German towns and withdrew. The Poles learned that they had been ships sacrificed in an attempt to bluff Hitler. When Stalin attacked Poland, there was no British declaration of war on Russia. After dividing Poland with Stalin, Hitler turned west to deal with the nations that had declared war on him. In 1940, he launched his blitzkrieg through the Low Countries and into the Ardennes. Primary beneficiary, British Tories had become the guarantors of Bolshevism. Moscow had been given free what Stalin would have paid as Tsar's ransom for. War between Nazi Germany and Britain and France would weaken all three and fertilize the ground for communist revolution in all three nations. Stalin's relief and joy can only be imagined. British and French emissaries soon arrived to offer Stalin an alliance, but without any commitment of his own. Stalin already had the benefit of an alliance with Britain. Russia could now afford to think only of her personal advantage. 12. Gruesome Harvest. Victors and vanquished, Mussolini declared war on Britain and invaded France. His armies invaded Egypt and Greece, where they quickly floundered. By 1941, Hitler occupied Europe west to the Pyrenees and south to Crete. These conquests had come about not because of some Hitlerian master plan, but because of a war with Britain that Hitler had never wanted, and an invasion of Greece by Mussolini that Hitler had opposed, except for Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland. Almost all of Europe was under either German occupation or a pro-Nazi regime. After invading Russia, Hitler had been stopped in the east and declared war on the United States. Nazi Germany was doomed. She would take 3 years to die and take down millions with her, leadership of the West would pass forever from Britain and Europe to the United States, and the 20th century would be the American century. Stalin emerged from the war as the most powerful czar in history, with the Red Army occupying Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. In the aftermath, communist parties would vie for power in Paris and Rome, and communist revolutionaries would help tear down the empires of the West. In 1949, China fell to the armies of Mao Zedong. In 1949, too, Stalin's scientists, with stolen American technology, exploded an atomic bomb, By 1948, Palestine was gone and Britain was surviving on Marshall Plan aid. France would be occupied for 4 years, The Vichy era marked by widespread collaboration. By war's end, Syria and Lebanon were gone. France was driven out of Algeria. Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland would endure 4 years of Nazi occupation. Poland would be occupied 5 years by Nazis and become the site of such horrors as Treblinka and Auschwitz. Germany would end the war occupied, in total ruin, Italy would be bombed and invaded by Anglo-American forces, Mussolini executed by communists, the Baltic republics Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, seized by Stalin in 1940, would suffer untold horrors, with the cultural, political, religious, and intellectual leaders of the three tiny nations disappearing forever in the labor and death camps of the Gulag Archipelago. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Eastern Germany would end up as captive nations of a new Soviet empire, ceded to Stalin by Churchill and FDR. They would suffer half a century of tyranny. The liberators of Auschwitz were servants of a regime that ran an even larger network of concentration camps of its own. World War II was less a war between fascism and freedom than a war between Nazism and Bolshevism. Hitler lost, Stalin won, for what happened to the Jews of Europe. Hitler and his collaborators in the unspeakable crimes bear full moral responsibility. Hitler's pogrom. Within weeks of Hitler's taking power came the Reichstag fire, which led to Dachau and the other camps to hold enemies of the regime. In 1935, Hitler imposed the Nuremberg laws, discriminating against Jews in every walk of life, yet though viciously anti-Semitic, Hitler's Reich had not gone genocidal. Nazi policy had been to make Jewish lives so miserable in Germany that the Jews would leave 6 weeks after Munich. However, came Kristallnacht, the German invasion of the Soviet Union triggered the rapid descent into full-scale genocide against the Jews. The destruction of the European Jews was not a cause of the war, but an awful consequence of the war. By 1942, Hitler held hostage virtually the entire Jewish population of Europe. What might have been, Britain surely played an indispensable role in bringing down Hitler and liberating Western Europe, but it was a supporting role. It was the Red Army that tore the guts out of the war matched, since 75%-80% of all German losses were inflicted on the Eastern Front. It follows that the efforts of the Western Allies accounted for only 20%-25%. The British contribution to victory must have been in the region of 5%-6%. Britons who imagine that we won the war need to think again. And before Britain's declaration of war on Germany brought Hitler's army west, Western Europe did not need liberating. As for Eastern and Central Europe, they were liberated by Stalin, 13. Hitler's ambition. Hitler's ambition. About Hitler's ambitions, historians yet disagree. On some issues all agree. Hitler's first goal was absolute power in Germany. A second was to overturn the Versailles Treaty, restore lands severed by Versailles and bring Germans home to the Reich, the Drang Nachlassen. Finally, Hitler intended to cleanse Germany of Jews, smash Bolshevism. To Hitler the Jews and Bolsheviks were one and the same enemy, The crucial lesson Hitler drew from defeat was that Germany must never again fight a two-front war. The lesson of defeat. Second, Hitler knew the longer a war went on, the weaker Germany became relative to her potential enemies. Hitler had also concluded that the Kaiser's decision to build a high-seas fleet to challenge the Royal Navy had been an act of monumental folly. Autarky is a word that recurs often in Hitler's talk. He would create a German world power to stand beside the other world powers, Hitler was as dedicated to Nazism as Lenin and Stalin were to Bolshevism, yet all three would sacrifice ideology for reasons of state. He was always prepared to drop ideology when it suited him. Hitler's dream alliance. To Hitler, Great Britain was Germany's natural ally and the nation and empire he most admired. He did not covet British colonies. What Hitler ever sought was an allied, friendly, or at least neutral Britain. Hitler, peace is possible with Britain, but not so long as Churchill is prime minister. Well into the war, Hitler held on to his impossible dream of an Anglo-German alliance. To him the British were a superior race, the Kriegsmarine. Hitler's navy was that of a Germany whose ambitions lay on land. Looking eastward, his strategic decisions make sense only if Hitler's true ambitions lay in the east. The failure of Britain and France to canalize Hitler's expansion in an eastward direction may reasonably be considered one of the greatest diplomatic failures in history. Though Bismarck had maintained good relations with Russia, the drive to the east was embedded deep in German history. Germany would concede the democracy's dominance west of the Rhine if they would cease interfering in the east. Why Britain would reject this, Hitler could never understand. He believed that Germany prepared to confront en bloc Bolshevism should cause rejoicing in the capitalist West, among British elites of the 20th century, there was always a streak of Germanophobia, an inordinate fear that Germany was secretly plotting the ruin of the British Empire and the conquest of the world. Did Hitler want the world? If Hitler was out to conquer the world, the proof cannot be found in the armed forces with which he began the war, Throughout the war, the U.S. Navy did not encounter a single German surface warship. Was America in mortal peril? Had Hitler pursued the plan to threaten the American homeland by the mid-1940s, 4 carriers manned by inexperienced German sailors would have been child's play for a U.S. Navy of more than 1,000 warships. The New York bomber. Throughout the war, not one German bomb fell on North or South America. The world greatly overestimated Germany's air strength. More than any other single factor, the failure of the Luftwaffe contributed to the eventual defeat of the Third Reich. No concrete evidence of any plan to invade the Western Hemisphere was discovered, although loose assertions of such plans were repeated so often before and during the war that some Americans were probably led to believe in the reality of this non-existent design, in U.S. cultural and intellectual circles, communism had immense appeal. The Roosevelt administration was honeycombed with Soviet spies, communists, and collaborators. Nazism and communism. Communism appealed to peoples of all colors and continents who wished to throw off the yoke of colonialism and bring an end to European domination. It offered all mankind a vision of a paradise on earth. In Hollywood, communism made such inroads by the late 1930s that anti-communist films could not be made and pro-Soviet films were routinely turned out. Hitler's rabid anti-Semitism meant Nazism was dead on arrival, to Americans, Hitler and Mussolini were figures of Chaplin-esque ridicule. Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky all had acolytes and admirers in government, in the press, and on the faculties and within the students' bodies of America's elite colleges and universities. As Yale scholar and historian Bruce Russett wrote, Nazism as an ideology was almost certainly less dangerous to the United States than is communism. Hitler did not believe in imposing it or exporting it to the West. Stalin believed in ruthlessly imposing communism on all subject lands and peoples. Like fascism, Nazism could not long survive the death of the Messiah, but the Soviet state was built to last, Historian Richard Pipes believes that Stalinism and Hitlerism were siblings of the same birth mother. Bolshevism and fascism were heresies of socialism. Communism masquerades, often successfully, under the guise of democracy. It is a greater danger because it is a false philosophy which appeals to many. Fascism is a false philosophy which appeals to very few. As we learned after Hitler's death, Nazism's roots were shallow and easily pulled up. But Marxist beliefs and ideology, even after the failure and collapse of the Soviet state, retain a hold on the minds of men and reappear constantly in new mutations. 14. Man of the Century. The armored train. The Boer War made Churchill famous, and both admired and distrusted all his life. In the armored train incident, Churchill had shown both reckless daring and dismal judgment. Both would mark his long career. Finest hour. Churchill's claim to be man of the century rests on a single year, 1940. Churchill might have entertained the idea of a negotiated peace, but he resisted the temptation and became the indispensable man who made the decision to fight on, to deprive England of its last hope for victory. Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, the one nation that more than any other would bring the Reich down. Indispensable man. Thus, by his refusal even to consider a negotiated peace, or armistice, Churchill caused Hitler to commit his fatal blunder. This would add 4 more years to the war and bring death to tens of millions and indescribable ruin to the continent of Europe, but also the downfall of Hitler. Churchill was thus the indispensable man, both in the destruction of Hitler's Reich and in the continuation of the war from 1940 to 1945. Was it worth it? A few British historians say Britain and the world would be a better place had England ended the war in 1940 after victory in the Battle of Britain, or in 1941 after the invasion of Russia. Most yet believe that if the cost of exterminating the Nazi regime of Hitler was 40 or 50 million more dead, the price had to be paid, to appease his great ally in 1942. Churchill would agree to Stalin's annexation of the Baltic republics, his plunder from the Devil's Pact with Hitler, and turn a blind eye to the Katyn massacre, about which Churchill suspected or knew the truth, that Stalin had perpetrated the massacre, the costs of victory, to ensure Stalin's domination of Europe. The Morgenthau plan envisaged turning the Ruhr into Gusland. The industrial region of the Saar was to be destroyed. All machinery and factory materials were to be turned over to the Russians. Germany was to be converted into an agricultural nation. Churchill said the plan was unnatural, unchristian and unnecessary. I'm all for disarming Germany, but we ought not to prevent her from living decently, Churchill, however, was informed that the economic survival of Britain might hinge on his support of the Morgenthau Plan. In a week, the U.S. press was ablaze over the plan and FDR was backpedaling. Churchill, however, would carry the plan to Stalin and Molotov. Churchill was discussing where the Iron Curtain would fall across Europe, and secretly and cynically ceding Eastern Europe and the Balkans to Stalin, save Greece, at Yalta in 1945. Churchill gave moral legitimacy to Stalin's control of half of Europe by signing a declaration on liberated Europe. The 100 million Europeans east of the Oder had to watch what democracy and freedom they had known before the war disappear, and then suffer the added humiliation of seeing such words as free elections, sovereignty, democracy, independence, and liberation deliberately corrupted, debased, made duplicitous, in the Declaration on Liberated Europe, the very title of which, given the ugly reality underneath, was a piece of calculated Soviet effrontery, one, however, that both Churchill and FDR acquiesced in, Churchill had to know in 1939 that any victory in alliance with Stalin would bring communism into the heart of Europe and replace Nazi tyranny with Bolshevik tyranny. Churchill knew of the mass murders on Lenin's orders, the massacre of the Tsar's family, Stalin's slave labor camps, the forced starvation in Ukraine, the great purge of the old comrades and Russian officer corps, the show trials, the pact with Hitler, the rape of Finland and the Baltic republics, Katyn. The number of deaths resulting from Stalin's policies before World War II was between 17 and 22 million, a 1,000 times the number of deaths attributed to Hitler as of 1939. The year Churchill was clamoring for war on Hitler and an alliance with Stalin, Churchill agreed to Stalin's use of Germans as slave laborers, and to the forced repatriation of millions of Russians, Ukrainians, and Cossacks to a barbaric Asiatic regime he had called the foulest murderers in all of history. Ethnic cleansing and slave labor. Solzhenitsyn, in their own countries Roosevelt and Churchill are honored as embodiments of statesmanlike wisdom. To us, in our Russian prison conversations, their consistent short-sightedness and stupidity stood out as astonishingly obvious. At Yalta 1945, Churchill and FDR capitulated to Stalin's demand that the new provisional Polish-German border be set at the Oder and western Nysa rivers. This meant 11 million people would be driven out of their homes, 2 million Germans would die in this largest forced transfer of populations in history, a crime against humanity of historic dimensions in which 20 times as many Germans were driven from their homes between 1944 and 1948 as the 600,000 Palestinians of the War of 1948, and more Germans died than all the Armenians who perished in the Turkish massacres of World War I. While this crime against humanity was being perpetrated, the Allies at Nuremberg, including Stalin's USSR, were prosecuting the Germans for crimes against humanity. The Soviet Union demanded German workforces as reparations. This was nothing more or less than trade in human beings, slavery. But the statesman had coined a euphemistic phrase for it, reparations in kind. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed, the British, by violating Norwegian neutrality, had drawn Hitler into Scandinavia. Churchill had blundered disastrously as military strategist. While the debacle was Churchill's doing, it was Chamberlain who fell. Churchill disparaged air powers against battle fleets, and dismissed the submarine. He could not have been more wrong, Churchill led the West into adopting the methods of barbarism of their totalitarian enemies. The moral progress of Churchill, the British outed German frightfulness first in theory, later in practice, and a nation which claimed to be fighting for a moral cause gloried in the extent of its immoral acts. Wolves with the minds of men. In one secret project, Churchill commissioned the preparation of 5 million anthrax cakes to be dropped onto the pastures of North Germany to poison the cattle and through them the people. The aim of Operation Vegetarian was to wipe out the German beef and dairy herds, and then see the bacterium spread to the human population. This would have caused many thousands or millions of German men, women and children to suffer awful deaths. Americans too played a role in adopting methods of barbarism from which earlier generations would have recoiled in horror and disgust. If Churchill initiated terror bombing, America perfected it. Churchill played the lead role in Western man's reversion to barbarism, the ferocity with which Churchill pursued war against civilians can be traced to his convictions. Churchill's convictions. Winston Churchill, an enthusiastic supporter of eugenics, reassured one group of eugenicists that Britain's 120,000 feeble-minded persons should, if possible, be segregated under proper conditions so that their curse died with them and was not transmitted to future generations. The plan called for the creation of vast colonies. Thousands of Britons unfit would be moved into these colonies. Hitler's ultimately genocidal program of racial hygiene began with a kind of compulsory sterilization of the feeble-minded and insane classes that Churchill urged on the British government, though a philo-Semite and supporter of Zionism, Churchill's views on the roots of Bolshevism seem not markedly different from those of Hitler. He admired Jews, respected their abilities and accomplishments, befriended Zionists and National Jews, and loathed only those apostates to their faith who had cast their lot with Lenin and Trotsky. Churchill's racial assumptions occupied a prime place both in his political philosophy and in his views on international relations. He was a convinced white supremacist and thought in terms of race to a degree that was remarkable, colored immigration weighed heavily on his mind. I think it is the most important subject facing this country, but I cannot get any of my ministers to take notice. Keep England white. By 1968, England was on its way to becoming the multiracial, multicultural nation of today, no longer Churchill's England, statesman, or war chief. The destruction of Germany, to which Churchill had dedicated himself, left a power vacuum in Europe Stalin inevitably filled. Britain fought Nazi tyranny for 6 years, only to pave the path to power for a greater tyranny. Churchill succeeded magnificently as a war leader. He failed as a statesman, milking the British cow. In 1955, Palestine, India, Egypt and the Suez Canal were gone. All the colonies in Asia and Africa were going. Russians and Americans were the hegemons of Europe and the dominions were looking to Washington, not London, for protection. The long and brilliant career of the man of the century coincided precisely with the decline and fall of Britain. As a world power and a great power, Britain was forced to sell all her commercial assets in the U.S. and turn over all her gold. FDR thought the British Empire an anachronism that ought to be abolished. Extraordinary paradox. Britain's principal enemy was anxious for the British Empire to remain in being, while her principal ally, the U.S., was determined to destroy it, in the two phases of the Great Civil War of the West, 100 million Europeans perished as victims of War 16. America inherits the empire. Indispensable man. Stalin's murders went on, and a triumphant communism conquered China and North Korea, leading to the mass murder of tens of millions, in 1945, Britain faced socialism at home, a near absolute dependency on the United States, and the displacement of Nazi Germany as dominant power in Europe by a Stalinist Russia with a revolutionary agenda that posed a far greater menace to British interests and Western civilization. The great man was given his own statue in Parliament Square, in negotiating with Stalin. Churchill made far greater blunders than Hyde Chamberlain in dealing with Hitler. How America triumphed. The U.S. kept out of the war until 6 months after Hitler had invaded Russia. America is the last superpower because she stayed out of the world wars until their final acts. America avoided the fate of the 7 other nations that entered the 20th century as great powers. The British, French, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman, and Japanese empires are all gone. The road less traveled by. America pursued a policy of containment and conscious avoidance of a third world war. America's answer was NATO, drawing a red line across Europe that the West could defend. American leaders of the late 1940s and 1950s believed that, while the fate of Poland and Czechoslovakia was tragic, both were beyond any U.S. vital interest. U.S. inaction was not due to cowardice but cold calculation as to what was worth risking war with a nuclear-armed Soviet Union, and what was not worth risking war. America never went to war with the Russia of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev, and won the Cold War by avoiding the blunders Britain made that plunged her into 2 world wars, with the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. America was at her apogee, replicating Churchillian folly. All the great European nations, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, were U.S. allies, as were Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt in the Middle East, and Australia, South Korea, and Japan in the Far East. In the Reagan era, Russia was converted from the evil empire of the early 1980s into a nation where he could walk red square arm in arm with Gorbachev. 400 million people in Europe and the USSR had been set free, America ought to have adopted a policy to protect what she had, for she had everything. Instead, we started out on the familiar road. We were now going to create our own new world order. After 9/11, The project took on urgency when George W. Bush was converted to a Wilsonian ideology of democratic fundamentalism. Only by making the whole world democratic can we make America secure. America exhibited an imperial hubris the whole world came to detest. There is hardly a blunder of the British Empire they have not replicated. As Chamberlain gave a war guarantee to Poland he could not honor, the United States began to hand out NATO war guarantees, as Britain had a balance of power policy not to permit any nation to become dominant in Europe. The 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States declares their intention not to permit any nation to rise to a position to challenge U.S. dominance on any continent. But time does not stand still. New powers arise, old powers fade, and no power can for long dominate the whole world. As Britain threw over Japan and drove Italy into the arms of Hitler, Bush pushes Russia's Putin into the arms of China by meddling in the politics of Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus, planting U.S. bases in Central Asia, and hectoring him for running an autocratic state that does not pass muster with a national endowment for democracy. Like the British before us, America has reached imperial overstretch, and to show the world he meant business, President Bush had placed in his Oval Office a bust of Winston Churchill,